Hello and welcome. We'll just give some time as people start to connect for the event before we start in a few seconds. Hello and welcome. I am Ottilia Maunganidze, the Head of Special Projects at the Institute for Security Studies. It is my honor today to moderate this discussion, seeking to respond to the question of what does the US's refugee suspension mean for Africa? In January of this year, the new US administration suspended the country's refugee resettlement program, cutting off legal pathways for thousands of refugees who had already been cleared for travel. At the same time, the US has also offered resettlement to South African Afrikaners under a separate policy track. In this seminar that the ISS is convening in partnership with the African Non-State Actors Platform on Migration and Development, we're exploring the humanitarian consequences of this suspension, the implications for Africa's refugee protection frameworks, and how non-state actors and regional bodies can respond to restrictive global migration policies. We have three speakers who will today attempt to respond to this question, but we know that many of you that have connected for this event are also experts in your own right, and we look forward to hearing your insights, your questions, your comments as the discussion ensues. Our first presenter will be Abdullahi Boru-Halake, who is the Senior Advocate for East and Southern Africa at Refugees International, an African policy expert with over a decade of experience in security, conflict, human rights, refugee work, as well as strategic communications. After him will be Jamin Wendandu Kusunwa, forced migration specialist and advocate for migrant inclusion, with also a decade of background in refugee law and policy advocacy. He currently serves as the Senior Advocacy Manager at the International Rescue Committee based in Kenya. And then finally, we will hear from Paddy Sianga Knudsen, a development economist currently coordinating the African Non-State Actors Platform on Migration and Development, with whom we have partnered on this event. She's also a vice president of the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism and a member of the Global Forum on Migration and Development's Civil Society International Steering Committee. So we have three experts in the sector who will be able to guide us through this conversation. I will now hand over to Abdullahi Halake for his presentation. You have the floor. Abdullahi, you have to unmute yourself, and I ask that everyone in the room keep your microphones on mute until we get to the discussion segment. Abdullahi, over to you.
Thank you so much. I will try to get my slides going, but while we get the slides sorted out, I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind is that it is not that we didn't know that this was in the post, meaning that this administration has signaled very clearly from the get-go that it will not tolerate African refugees or refugees for that matter, because to them, the question of refugees was really a question that wasn't a question, because they have made it very clear before the elections, they have made it very clear after the elections that they are going to do away with migration altogether. It's not just the refugees. To them, they consider refugees as a problem that needs to be solved. I think I'm having some trouble with getting the slides. I will ask the administrator if they can to probably help me getting the slides on. But the place that I want to start.
We could see your shared screen, but you've now just unshared your screen.
let me go back to it and see if it can work. I apologize in advance to the audience that I'm not very technologically savvy. Can you see my screen now better? It needs to be bigger though. Hope technology cooperates. So while the slides are loading, I think a good place to start this conversation is
We see your
really,
screen fine now.
yeah, the good place to start this really is the previous administration, right? The previous administration, meaning the Trump 1.0, he made it very clear, but with a fair degree of destruction, that they do not want migration. And this should not be taken as just an American problem. It is really a problem for the West, really. It is a problem even the governments that consider multilateralism, governments that consider cosmopolitanism, governments that say that they really would want refugees to come because it's better for everybody to travel, to engage, and all that. They tried during the first administration, and they did not succeed. And part of it was a function of them not very well versed in how the government works. But in this particular administration, they were very clear. They signaled it before the election, during the election, and after the election. They are doing what they are supposed to do. I want us to bear that at the back of our minds. The second part that we really need to have at the back of our minds is the solution to refugee problem, and particularly the African solution to the refugee question, doesn't sit, as we sometimes reckon, outside Africa. In fact, we have got good cases of African countries that have done great job in not just accepting the refugees, in fact, changing the refugee status for the refugees to become citizens. So I think that is what we need to bear at the back of our minds. And finally, before I launch into my presentation, there are three durable solutions to the refugee question. One is the refugees going back to their home country upon the country being peaceful, them feeling free, whatever they were running away, completely ending. The second one is integration into the country that they have sought refuge. And the third one is resettlement into a third country, meaning most of the time into the West. The third one, it is less than 1% of how the refugee has been solved. What I'm trying to say is less than 1% of global refugees have been resettled in the West. And that's why I started by saying that the solution to the refugee problem, it does not necessarily rely on, as part of the durable solution pathways, to them going to the United States, to them going to other countries. For the purposes of this conversation, I think President Donald Trump issued two executive orders. One was that of January 20th, where the executive order was realigning the United States program. And as part of that package, it suspended the United States refugee admission program completely. All right. The second executive order was the executive order that was issued February 5th that gave an expedited pathway to the refugees, to the Afrikaners from South Africa. If you assess both of these, the argument that the Trump administration made for giving the Afrikaners was they were facing white genocide in South Africa, something that is demonstrably false, that even attempt by President Cyril Ramaphosa to try and explain to him that that doesn't exist didn't persuade him. Some of the photos and the video evidence that were used when President Ramaphosa visited the White House were not necessarily from South Africa. That just shows you that it is not a question of capacity, why the United States completely suspended U.S. refugee admission program, it was purely a political play. It doesn't matter. The reason why people seek refuge is a genuine fear of persecution based on race and many other criteria that are very clear according to the UN refugee UN refugee convention. The South Africans, the white South Africans who are being taken to the United States, expedited no less, do not meet that criteria. So I think these two executive orders provide a window into why the United States went about doing what it did in terms of suspending the refugee program. Just to give you numbers, the United States takes in quite a huge chunk of African refugees, right? I think so last year, 34,017 were taken in. A huge chunk of those were from the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have some from Sudan. We have some from other countries. Then you can see that one of the reasons for people seeking refuge really is conflict. You can literally superimpose on the map of African refugee map on the conflict, and you see those two things fitting because people are really running away from genuine fear of persecution because of conflict in the country. I think for anybody who is interested in not just the refugee question, but the relationship between the United States and the African continent, this photo and this meeting is very illustrative. All right. Before even the meeting, during the elections, there were elements within the Republican Party, and that has the president's ear, no less somebody in the form of Elon Musk's, was saying that South African government doesn't do this. South African government receives a lot of money from us, and a lot of it has got nothing to do with the refugees. Quite a huge chunk of that has got everything to do with the Gaza story that, South Africa went to the ICJ. A lot of it, again, has got nothing to do with anything to do with refugees, and it's got everything to do with the Ukraine, where the South African government took the position that it took. So the South African government had to be brought to a heel. And it is within that context that this meeting took place. I think the halting of the refugee resettlement for people who are facing well-founded fear of persecution while granting an expedited refugee status to Afrikaners offers a small window into how Trump sees not just the continent, not just South Africa, but also the continent. If neglect, and even you can go as far as calling it contempt for the continent. He's never visited the African continent as a president. Very few high-level government ministers or cabinet secretaries visited the African continent during his first term. It just shows that during this particular term, it is not just neglect, it's not just contempt, it will be purely determined by pursuing a very extractive, mercantilist approach to the African continent. Because literally, the South African president was being badgered. What can he trade for relationship between South Africa and the United States? And it's going to be the same for many African presidents that are going to visit the United States. Again, like I mentioned at the top, durable solution to the refugee takes three pathways: return to the home country, integration into the host country, and resettlement in third countries. But of all these three pathways, one, conflicts are taking significantly longer to resolve on the continent. By average now, it takes 20 years for conflict to resolve. Pick your case, you have the Somalia, the DRC, Sudan now has been bubbling, South Sudan, and these are net generators of refugees. But if conflicts takes long, if we get back to our three durable solutions, it means refugees going back to their home countries. It's very, very difficult. But the third option is resettlement into a third country that takes less than 1%. Then what we are left with is integration into countries where the refugees have sought refuge becomes the most reliable template. In the case of the impact of Donald Trump's aid cuts for the refugees in Kenya, one of the countries that is pursuing socioeconomic integration of refugees, that has hosted refugees since 1991-92, they are hosting close to 1 million refugees. Once the aid is cut, because the United States provide a significant amount of not just humanitarian aid, but direct support to the refugee program, refugees protested because it is about food. Because one thing that we have to bear in mind about refugee support is a lot of it is direct. It's food, it's shelter, it's protection. So once you vacuum aid out of that system, the impact are going to be very, very direct. Secondly, Somalia, again, poster child for many of the crises, humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis, displacement crisis, combined because of conflict, but also Somalia is ground zero of climate change. For a country that contributes less than 1%, it faces significant flooding, it faces significant food insecurity. Because of Trump's aid cuts to the refugees, we are seeing people losing their lives. In Kenya now, like I mentioned, 40% of food basket assistance to the refugees, 40% to these refugees have been reduced. And if more support is now coming for the agencies that are providing some of this support, that cut will go to even as low as 20% per month. In Kenya, in Ethiopia, the Ethiopia humanitarian plan for last year received less than 29%. What this is indicating is that even before this cut, most of the humanitarian response in some of these countries, including refugees and otherwise, were not getting the support that it is required, meaning humanitarian agencies have to barter and borrow and to get over the line. In Ethiopia now, 1 million refugees will stop getting the aid that they require. In Uganda, World Food Program will cut probably the support that it's giving to 1 million refugees. And these are countries, Kenya hosting, slightly over 1 million, that is over 800,000. If you add the number of people who are in the registration pipeline, that number could go to 1 million. Ethiopia is hosting 0.93 million. That number could go up if you add others because of the recent displacement from Sudan or some of the, Ethiopians that have sought refuge in Sudan. If they come back, Uganda, they're hosting 1.6 million. So you're looking at countries that, in the case of Ethiopia, that is simultaneously hosting refugees while generating refugees. And if you look at the economic realities of these countries, they are all facing serious macroeconomic headwinds. The debt to GDP ratio is almost 2/3, meaning they cannot borrow to really support their citizens, let alone refugees. And more fundamentally, Uganda, it has an open door policy for the refugees. Kenya, it's allowing for socioeconomic integration of refugees, meaning refugees do not need to sit down and sit just in camps and waiting for food aid. They are allowing them they're allowing them to access the labor market so that they can be dependent on themselves, because to be a refugee doesn't necessarily mean that you do not have agency. You might have education to a certain level. Secondly, they're allowing for freedom of movement. In Uganda, it's an open door policy, like I mentioned. Ethiopia, just at the end of last year, allows for the refugees for a bundle of rights so that they can be reliant on themselves. At the time when these countries are doing this, at the time when Western countries are really closing the doors on the refugees, these countries are pursuing a pathway of one of the pathways for durable solution, but now aid is being vacuumed out of that system. Economically, they are in a very difficult situation. So what we are going to witness in the next couple of months are some of the serious problems with the refugees with these countries. Just like I mentioned, durable solution to refugees does not sit outside African continent. For instance, Tanzania granted 162,000 Burundian refugees citizenship, and this was the largest UNHCR granting of citizenship for a very long time. And but the number of Burundian refugees still, because of the conflict in Burundi, are still coming into Tanzania. Like I mentioned, Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia have shown that there are solutions to the refugee problem. They are taking a fairly positive steps. But imagine countries that are facing all these economic challenges, and you're telling them, let's say in the case of Kenya or even Uganda, absorb these refugees into your education system, into your health system, into your infrastructure, into your housing. That would really strain these countries. Is it all doom and gloom? I don't think it is. African Union Protocol on Free Movement of Person can offer one of the pathways. However, the intra-African mobility does not explicitly mention refugees or people who are being displaced by climate migration directly. And that is really challenging, because if you look at the OAU definition of refugees, it includes people who have been displaced, right, because of public order being disturbed, and let's say flooding, let's say food insecurity. All these falls under this. However, the protocol does allow for states to establish special procedures for vulnerable groups, which could include refugees and asylum seekers. I'll mention about one thing before I hand it over. It is the question around the World Bank. Because for a very long time, anybody who's been involved in aid system know that the care and maintenance of refugees, having them in camps, is not sustainable. We need to figure out a development-led approach, largely in urban areas, because that's where a lot of refugees go and look for aid. For instance, in the case of Kenya, the refugee camps are located in far-flung region up in the northeast and northwest. These are regions where poverty levels are around 70, 78, especially in the Turkana side. So as a result, World Bank is trying to do this, and it has a window for host countries, host communities, and refugees, if applied well, can really be part of the package of solution to the refugee situation. I stop there and hand over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdullahi. You've spoken to the broader ecosystem in which some of these decisions that have been made by the US administration, where they come from, and that perhaps the most important here is, while of course the impact is grave, that this could have been foreseen, that there were statements made prior to these decisions that already suggested that this is what was on the horizon. Now, I am going to turn, there's a number of issues and questions that we would want you to expand on in a moment, but I'm going to turn to Jamina Kuswanya for your insight on this particular topic, on the impact of the US's decisions in respect of refugee protections, but also on the broader impact on the humanitarian ecosystem, so to speak. Over to you, Jamin.
Thank you very much. I share many sentiments with Abdullahi, and therefore I'll be careful not to overemphasize some of the points that he has done. But then from the very outset, I think the suspension of the refugee program caused us to reflect and ask the question about what are these particular drivers of displacement and what exactly should we have done better. I see these as a more focus on what is the prevention towards displacement, because what we have done many times is the response aspect of it, and the suspension by US government is actually then a suspension of the response mechanisms that we have been having. And so I see the need for us to ask the questions about what is the contribution of the numbers that are displaced globally coming from sub-Saharan Africa. What we see is the push factors for the displacement of this particular population, even as we look at what the executive orders mean and what more is it that we should put in place, especially as a prevention elements towards displacement. Because then the reality of the migration governance and migration space seems to be taking a different direction from what we have been used for the various decades. And therefore, African countries, African stakeholders, African civil society organizations, they need to begin asking the right questions about how then do we respond better in these particular times. And so when I see the total number of the displaced population, and I begin figuring out that 76% in developing countries, most of these again in Africa, about 20% living in the sub-Saharan Africa, but also looking at the drivers of this, whether it's conflicts, political instability, or even economic opportunities, then it begins to tell us that we are also one of the biggest then producers of the displaced communities within the globe. Abdulai pointed into this, and that the internally displaced persons equally within the African region, when you look at the close to 120 million displaced populations, we have a huge significant of that, almost 70 million being IDPs. And Africa and the Horn of Africa specifically have significant number of displaced population. And this adds into these particular numbers when we begin speaking about then the effect of the suspension of migration program. I think to point out at this particular point is to reflect that just last year, the global report on internal displacement for 2025 points that we have more than 12 million internally displaced persons, for instance, in the Horn of Africa. And so it adds into the number, then begins calling to us to reflect what exactly our solutions need to be. But then what have been the push factors driving displacement in this particular region? Armed conflict, whether we're speaking about in South Sudan, in Congo, generalized extremisms and violence, and not being able to arrest some of these particular issues at a very early stage, whether in the Shabab and Boko Haram driving displacement across the border and fear for their populations, leading to persons living either in camps within the IDP setup, but even those that are moving across the country to neighboring countries. But we also see human rights abuses and oppressions on some of the countries and states, and therefore the hunting down of dissenting voices, forcing people then to seek alternative options and movement. And so it is quite important that we then address the push factors clearly if we are going to be able to prescribe the appropriate solution to the issues that we continue to find. But environmental degradation and climate-related shocks have been some of the key issues that the African countries have suffered over the years. And so whether it's drought or it's floods, 2 years ago in the Horn of Africa, we had more than 20 million people in dire need of food because of the drought. We have crop failure. We have issues, whether it's grazing land. And it begins to worry us to ask the question, are we having climate change fueling displacement? But also the other question, and with the response is in the affirmative, is that are we having climate change also violence actually causing climate displacement? Because the crowding of camps, the crowding of IDPs, and the destruction of the environments where these particular populations are actually hosted, we begin then to see floodings in those particular areas and therefore displacement of the populations. So these being key issues that then the African countries need to begin asking, that then what then becomes the root causes of this, and how can we then be able to uproot and come up with some solutions? When we look at the question of burden sharing and governance, two things come into play. That the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Migration calls for more solidarity and equitable burden sharing among states. There is a recognition that, for instance, when you look at the number of displaced populations, is that 80%, for instance, are hosted in countries that produce less than 20% of the world income. And so there is a need then for support of those particular countries to be able to see how can we be able to shoulder the burden of the countries hosting the refugees. But the more question that we need to ask, and for me as Africans, is that are we also the biggest then producers of these displaced communities? So even as we ask for the aspect of burden sharing, what then exactly does this mean? And the call for burden sharing flies in the face of the executive orders that we have seen. Are we seeing states that are hosting this displaced population receiving the level of support that they're looking for from the global sense? But even at the African continent level, the African Union Migration Policy Framework for 2018 to 2030 acknowledges that there is a need for member states to come together and support host countries to cope up with the burden of hosting refugees. I would dare say, from this particular point, that little has been done for us to be able to see how do we then support those particular countries. And the effect of that is the suffering, the lack of services, the limited access and lack of dignity to populations that have been displaced because of one particular issue or the other. So the two executive orders, and Abdullahi mentioned the second, I won't go into that, is that the foreign aid suspension and the refugee admission limits speaks to the situation of the need for us to devise better ways of refugee response. The biggest bulk of funding, for instance, that goes to UNHCR, World Food Program, come from the United States of America. What we have seen, and from the conversations over the last couple of months, is that other countries in Europe have also begun to signal that they're going to be reducing foreign assistance in the coming years periodically, which I think is a response then of what the United States have done. And so it calls for us then to begin a different way of reflection. But when you look at the refugee admission numbers, and this has been put out over the last 5 years, it begins to tell you that quite a very insignificant number of people, as Abdullahi put it, actually moved toward the aspect of resettlement. And US government have been taking the bulk number of these particular populations over the years. And so as a durable solution, resettlement doesn't seem to be one of those particular issues. The repatriation, the voluntary repatriation of people going back home, again, has not worked over the years. When you look at the protracted situation of refugees, we see that 66% of these displaced populations are still living in protracted situations. And though the longer period is defined as 5 years in displacement situation, we are seeing incidences of averages of 9 years, and some places almost 2 decades of people still in displaced population. And so it tells us that then the solutions that we have then been working on, of resettlement, which has been the reliant, but also the local, the repatriation have not then been able to work over the years, and therefore we need to ask the question about how do we then better these particular issues. So what we have is just a comparison between what is it, the numbers that the US have been able to absorb over the last 5 years over the global resettlement aspects. And it tells you that it is a drop into the ocean for us to emphasize this as a solution and therefore begin looking for most probably homegrown solutions towards this. The number coming from Africa is quite insignificant of the issues and problems that we continue to have. So what do we then see as the response to this particular migration shift? And for me is that we need to invest more on and move from response to prevention. We have many mechanisms within the African continent that we can then be able to utilize and strengthen the early warning systems, whether for conflict or even for climate issues that we're having. And so we step in advance to prevent this level of displacement happening. Climate resilience is a core thing. Every one of us realizes the vagaries of climate change over the years. And so our focus in terms of how then do we prevent this from happening. The 1969 OU Convention on refugees acknowledges that persons who have been affected by matters disturbing public order could be able to seek asylum. But I think when we look at the scale into which climate change has been able to affect populations, it is going to be difficult for us to cope with the response aspect of it, and therefore seeing how then do we invest on the prevention, whether at the regional blocks, whether at the continental level. This needs to be some things that we need to begin working on. I know that governments can't be able to do this alone, and therefore the rest of the stakeholders needs to move into this. Free movement protocols and refugee frameworks is one of the things that we need to fast track the ratification to facilitate intercontinental mobility and reduce the irregular routes that we have in the globe, and leveraging whether ECOWAS, SADC, and IGAD to be able to see how then do we guarantee the basic rights of people to access to basic services. Because it is down into us that because we are having protracted situation, we need to be able to advance the dignity of this particular population, because resettlement, which is an option that we have relied for a long period of time, does not give us those particular results that we're focusing on. But then that is about the durable solutions. I kind of emphasize more what Abdullahi said. Local integration is going to be a critical aspect if we're going to deal with the displaced communities and see how they can be able to contribute to our local economies. A voluntary repatriation, there is a need for us to silence the guns when it is the guns, work on the climate stress issues that cause displacement, work on the psychological counseling and the return and the reintegration of this particular population in a more orderly, organized, and planned manner. Because we have seen over the years that we have had repatriation and people then go back again, get displaced because of the same issues, because of lack of well-coordinated aspect, either between the UN bodies, the host countries, in the countries of origin where they are definitely coming from. And I think lastly, is for us to ask the question, as we build sustainable funding for displacement, how do we include private sector to invest in the displaced population, invest in skilling, invest in renewable energy, even as we seek to operationalize our AU migration policy framework and the Kampala Declaration on IDPs to ensure equitable burden sharing and financial solidarity with states that are hosting a majority of the refugees. Because what we begin to see is that then host countries are beginning to feel the pain of hosting populations, and therefore there is a need for us to step forward to support them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamin, for that. I think, again, a reminder that the context in which these changes have been made is one, an ever-evolving context, but it's also one in which we are likely to see less and less financial or other aid from the rest of the world coming into Africa to be able to address some of the issues that you raise, whether it is around sustained prevention of conflicts, better management of ongoing crises, but also around the distribution of much needed humanitarian aid and assistance to communities currently not displaced, but that may be going forward. So this is a slew of approaches that we would need to together, I imagine, craft more informed but pragmatic approaches, because the US's decision is perhaps, if what Abdullahi and Jamin have said, is perhaps just the start of greater shifts that we will see in the way in which humanitarian aid or assistance is provided, but importantly also in the way in which African countries, still currently being the primary hosts of displaced Africans, taking on greater responsibility, whether by will or by the fact that this is the context in which we find ourselves. So not always voluntarily doing so, but because they are proximate to the context in which people are fleeing. I turn now to you, Paddy, for your reflections. Jameen ended by referring to the number of different other actors that could be involved beyond the state. And I know, of course, with your work on the African Non-State Actors platform, this is basically the core of the work that you are doing. Who are these other actors that can be central to addressing some of these issues, or that already are? But would also just be interested to hear from you, your reflections on the broader impact, perhaps as Ottilia and Jameen have done, using the US's decision as a starting point, but would be interested to hear your thoughts also, perhaps on Europe and some of the shifts that we are seeing there. Over to you, Paddy.
Thank you so much, Ottilia. And sort of, in listening, both to Ottilia and Jamil, I think one of the things that really crossed my mind was to just do a quick relook back and maybe opening up the discussion a bit on legal pathways and how that has looked like. Because of course, what we've seen more vividly out of the Trump administration in terms of some of the measures that came from the executive orders is really stepping back on some of the progress that the global migration space, the global space around refugee management, and the space in which we provide international protection for people who need it really shrink. And so maybe, just zooming in, I was thinking about on the very day, 20th of January, I think when we woke up to sort of an awakening of what the reality would be. At the same time, I think it was in Davos that there was the World Economic Forum, and along the side of the World Economic Forum, there was a roundtable discussion there that was talking about migration potential. So you can imagine on one side in the United States of America, we have a leader brought into power that could see this space much more shrinking, so not really recognizing the power and agency that's there in migrants and refugees. But then also on the other side, where you see even this, cross section of leaders that have met, they were really trying to look at, how can we have a collective action to deal with the challenges that have to do with migration. And this global leader that had been held, I think, on a high pedestal, decided to kind of just step down, take a few steps behind, and said, I don't want to be the global leader anymore. And instead, went on ahead with, as I always say, putting America first is not a bad thing. Everyone wants to put their nationals first, but that happens within an ecosystem of coexistence. On the African continent, we call it Ubuntu, meaning that, my existence is as relevant as yours in the space of community. In whichever way that would be interpreted. So I thought that was really interesting to sort of see these parallels, from one global leader to another space within Europe where migration was being discussed. But I mean, I think we can also say when we look at the executive orders, and colleagues have spoken before me have already kind of really gone into this analysis, which has been rich enough, so I will not highlight on it. But then I thought, fast forward a bit, April 6th, South Sudan was on the agenda of the American government, revoking visas of South Sudanese passport holders and really blocking new arrivals. And the reason related to South Sudan not accepting nationals that were expelled from the US. Just more recently, the Trump administration has just ordered, and this is in relation to news around, this is student mobility. So, we are all talking about the youth that we need for tomorrow, skills mobility. We're talking about making sure we have a youth that's ready to take on the future workplaces. But then, knowing that America has been a center of excellence in terms of education, but from the Trump administration point, no, let's stop scheduling visa interviews for foreign students, because it was really trying to think, oh, we need a much more comprehensive way to screen all these international students. So you can see sort of these from a political standpoint, but from where we are seeing reality, these disconnects, if you like, and much of it really targeted at Global South. And the majority of that, of course, for us from an African perspective, has been really important for us to look at. So as the African Non-State Actors Platform, which is you know, a network of diaspora actors, civil society, and trade unions working together on migration governance, what we seek to do is to really not just challenge the status quo, because we need that for advocacy, but to challenge the status quo because it's really important for migrants, their families, and host communities, and to sort of show what can we get out of the promise of migration for sustainable development. So how do we use migration and mobility as we see it in these particular spaces that can work for development, because people will always be on the move. Trade, finance and trade, as we have known, has been able to move from one place to another, but facilitated by people. And so even if we want to see advancements in terms of trade and finance, without the mobility aspect, that would not be possible. We have seen, for instance, in Europe, when they talked about research and development and trying to enhance that, one of the first things that Europe had to pursue was to look at the mobility of researchers and what that has meant. But the same would also happen in spaces like China. And so when you think about places where we have seen any level of advancement, mobility has really been at the center, even when we're talking about exchange of knowledge. And so it's not surprising also in this context that it was brought. So I thought, Ottilia, apart from just giving a little bit of what I thought was of this background, kind of some important points. I think from the European perspective, or if you're looking at Africa-Europe migration governance, even there, we're still seeing those kind of double standards, right? So we see double standards in the way vulnerable migrants are being treated, vulnerable migrants are being welcomed, but also in the management of mixed migration flows. And so the Global South was not quite surprised by the extent that we saw the US government take its very firm position through executive orders, and what we continue to see as a shrinking space in terms of visa facilitation and mobility. So, but a couple of parallels that we saw, and from our perspective, we're saying maybe we need to learn better. I want to take you to the European Union at a time in which Ukraine was in crisis. So we're talking about the aggression that happened on Ukraine from Russia. And in the context of those migration flows, we found ourselves, and I think to also the shock of African nationals, particularly African governments, I think African families were much aware of this. As usual, people know more than governments in most cases. They knew that we had students, we had families of African origin, who had African heritage as well, living, thriving in Ukraine. And so when it was time to provide temporary protection for those who were fleeing Ukraine, Europe, one of Africa's closest partners, had a one-liner for all third country nationals. And third country nationals is the category that most African passport holders, or African passport holders, actually would fit in. And that simply said, go home. I'm paraphrasing. It simply said, go home. And quite an amount of analysis has been done in looking at spaces where international protection was actually required for people. But instead of taking the affirmative action, instead of leaning into the breadth of human rights declarations that we have, or other human rights instruments, or those instruments indeed that allow governments to tap on and build up an argument to provide international protection from those fleeing from war, the option was to ask African passport holders to go home. This was the perspective, this is a bit of an analysis from the Temporary Protection Directive, but we've written quite extensively about this. A colleague of mine, Dr. Amanda Bisson, and Dr. Andrea Milan in the World Migration Report kind of look at what is the impact, what has been really the impact of global migration governance in terms of dealing with migration crisis. And you see one of these things as sort of a failure of the global system. Another failure that we see out of the global system, where we can learn a little bit closer, is seeing the closed doors that we've seen for African migrants and many other migrants that are considered in this so-called package of difficulty. That's the perspective that comes from the European perspective of dealing with asylum seekers. And when we look at African migrants, when we looked at not just the caseload but we looked at the failed asylum statistics, but we also look at how many are provided with asylum and those that are granted international protection. We continue to see a pushback against them, trying to really push them back into the territories. Yes, there are issues around mixed migration and mixed migration flows, but the point is not to make visa restrictions even more tighter, or to push them back to the territories of which they come from, or even worse, to negotiate with countries of transit so that these migrants are not able to go through. So these are the strategies that we continually see being repeated from the European side. Again, important trade partners for us, whether it's in trade, it's finance, but also in terms of knowledge exchange. And then we continue to see maybe a little bit opening the global space, right, Ottilia? The Global Compact on Migration, I think, quite some excitement when it came to life, and after having waited for so long to have member states at least agree on a couple of clear objectives of how migration will be governed, but also how migration would also be looked at as sort of something that is an intergovernmentally managed a challenge, but also to look within the opportunity, because that's what the 23 objectives really speak to. We still see that post the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration, yes, it is non-binding, but even post that, it didn't provide inspiration for member states to be able to pick from it and to be able to indeed move and provide protection for those who are vulnerable. But indeed, one of those objectives speaks to legal pathways, GCM number 5, which we call the cornerstone GCM. I mean, basically to have a ripple effect on most of the 23 objectives that have been outlined. And when you see the way the GCM is also being implemented, particularly by global north countries, which are countries of destination and countries of transit, you will see an emphasis on cherry picking, even on this global inspiration, a plate that we could pick from, this plate of ingredients that we have. And the ingredient that is most common, that is most commonly picked by member states, is to really look at the labor migration front. Why? Because it deals with a problem in the Garden of Europe. And the Garden of Europe has an issue with laborers. It has an issue with labor. And so it becomes a very convenient space for us to use this space. But also when we talk about social protection, we see the weaknesses, for instance, in the very same member states to adopt, for instance, ILO conventions that talk about social protection for families, for migrants and their families to be able to thrive and live well. We see different difficulties in them providing a more social cohesion. And so, racism and xenophobia are some of those consequences that we see coming up on the other side due to this nature of cherry picking what really works for the Garden of Europe. And so maybe these are kind of the highlight strategies that one would try to avoid if you were trying to coin a migration governance, a well-managed migration governance that really works not just for countries of destination, but that they work for countries of origin, they work for countries of transit, and most important, that they work for migrants and their families and for host communities. And as I wrap up, Ottilia, I was thinking that, the question had talked about coining solutions, and I won't go deep into it, but I thought, one of the most important points as we talk about coining solutions and looking a little bit forward is for us to think about data from within the African continent of how we have managed displacement, internal displacement within the African continent, which also has an international cross-border connotation, as has been explained by others. And I think we can get excellent examples from the number of countries. I was really happy to see in the presentation the naturalization of the 1972 Burundis in Tanzania, one that was not an easy one. So often, people make reference to this, and I remember being in Tanzania at the time, there was a lot of talk from within the parliament. Where would these naturalized Burundis go? What will it mean in terms of them as a group of people? How do they continue to coexist as a people where they've come from? So it has not come as something that was very easy for Tanzanians also to welcome. But at the same time, we see today that, it's still being used as that best practice and an example. And of course, other African solutions that we look at is the free movement protocol. And maybe this closure of doors that we see from around us maybe brings us back to finding homegrown solutions. Now, we know we need about 11 signatures for us to get the free movement protocol going. And what would that mean? It would mean that, visa facilitation becomes a little bit, we start to push on it. We start to push on mobility. We start to push on migration and settlement and many other aspects. And we start to deal with the gaps that we sort of see in terms of the involvement of various stakeholders. And we're talking private sector, we're talking diaspora, we're talking trade unions, we're talking qualification authorities. All these remain very important for us to really revive and bring back what we see as comprehensive migration governance frameworks for the African continent, but can also inspire things like the AU-EU partnerships that we have on migration governance, and so on and so forth, and all those others. I will end, Ottilia, probably by saying that, in a lot of times when we're talking about exchanges, and I was looking within the US that, the AGOA was soon to come up for extension. And another opportunity that we see, South Africa, once again at the center stage, is that it is hosting, the Group of 20 Summit. And, so for us as Africans, this is quite an exciting moment because we get to see a little bit more of what those US-Africa relations are going to look like. But we really get to have a different way for us to negotiate and what that does look like. And I will end by saying, I don't know if you noticed, but I was thinking about the responses. And one of the responses that really triggered me when I think it was the visa bans as they were being announced, was that Namibia decided to very quickly just reform the entry requirements for US citizens, US tourists coming to Namibia. And what does this mean? I think this also shows a signal. And we're not saying we want to close the door against those who close the doors for us. But I think, we would like to reciprocate, and I think if African governments really come together, working together with the diversity of civil society to advocate for migration governance that really works, and a migration governance that's been reframed on human rights principles. I will stop here, Ottilia, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Paddy, for that. I would say two key messages from you, which is in all of this conversation that we are having, it is important for us to center those that have been forcibly displaced, as well as those that voluntarily migrate as well, that whatever approach or policy has to remain human-centered. And the second is a recognition that as the world shifts and changes, now is the time for Africa to be taking the lead on addressing issues that impact the African continent. We've heard the refrain before, but I think now is beyond just saying it, actually working towards some of those solutions. Colleagues, those of you that have been tuning in and listening attentively, now is the time to also hear your thoughts, your reflections. But if you do have questions for any of our panelists, we also welcome you to please raise your hand. If you would like to do that, you just go to the bottom of your screen where it says react, and then select to raise your hand in that way, and then you will be given the floor. Thank you to Joseph Guya, who's already started the conversation around being more forward-thinking, looking towards solutions. He offers two strategies for Africa to address the shift. First, to enhance regional cooperation, and here he looks to the African Union as well as regional economic communities and mechanisms working together on refugee response strategies and pooling of resources, as well as establishing formally so a continental humanitarian fund that seeks to streamline emergency responses. And then second, he proposes the diversification of funding sources, which involves engaging with non-traditional donors, such as China, the Gulf states, and private philanthropic organizations, and then also encouraging contributions from the diaspora through remittance-backed development bonds. Paddy, I know that you have a lot of thoughts around this remittance aspect, so I would welcome your inputs in a moment. But I'm going to, while we wait for colleagues to raise their hands, to put their questions, thoughts, and reflections in the chat as well, I'll turn back to you, Abdullahi, because one of the things that you spoke about really is around what Joseph is proposing here, which is this enhancement of cooperation on the African continent. So would be interested to hear your views, because I know, of course, within the scope of the African Union's Humanitarian and Social Affairs Department, that this conversation on not just a continental humanitarian fund, but on coordination of action, on streamlining has been ongoing. So would really be interested to hear your thoughts on how we can pragmatically also take this forward. And then to Jamin, you raised the issue also around non-state actors, so beyond the state. So would be interested to hear your views on those. And then I'll hand over the floor to Woldia Begasho. You have the floor. You're welcome to unmute yourself. And then after you, Kirsty Hwateng. Woldia, you have the floor. Please unmute yourself. While you attempt to do that, I'll hand over to Kirsty. Kirsty, you have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you to ISS for this event, and thank you to the panelists for their contributions. My question is for Abdullahi. You said that less than 1% of refugees are settled in Western countries, but in the case of the US, regarding African refugees, that they do take a significant amount, although I know not as much as African countries do. Would you happen to know what percentage of African refugees go to the US? I don't know if that was good. Okay, is that clear? Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kirsty, for that. I'll turn back to you then, Abdullahi, Jamin, and Paddy in that order, waiting for Woldia to be able to unmute themselves. Please go ahead.
I think if I'm heard very clearly, the question that I didn't catch his name, the gentleman spoke to around the question of remittance. I think it is one of the most unexploited area when it comes to humanitarian affairs. Let's give you some numbers. In Somalia, they send annually $2 billion into Somalia, largely by the diasporans. But, you know, last year, the Somalia humanitarian plan was 1.6 billion. All right. So I think we need to figure out how we can use the diaspora remittances to really get things going, because it is an area that is unexploited. I think in the case of Sudan, I think probably 2% Sudanese in the diaspora send probably close to 2% of GDP every year into Sudan, just, you know, as part of the remittances. This is an untapped potential that probably within the humanitarian space, we really need to wake up and start seeing that there are many ways of doing this job. In the case of Sudan now, since the beginning of the conflict, Sudanese diasporans are the ones who are standing up the, you know, emergency response rooms inside Sudan. And this again is purely you know, groups, neighborhood groups that really prop up during the revolution against Omar Hassan al-Bashir, and they have retained their identity. They continue to be having probably a negligible amount of overhead when compared to international NGOs. And, you know, a lot of the time when you hear donors not wanting to support groups like them, their argument has always been, oh, there are risk factors involved, because of accountability and getting the trail of where the money is going. In fact, this group has been able to really account for all the money that they have got. So I think there is an opportunity, to my mind, that the era of big aid is gone. And we are entering a brave new world that requires, in many ways, brave new ideas of resolving this particular problem. Donald Trump is not by any means who started this particular crisis that we are in. Foreign aid has been on decline for a very long time. He just accelerated it. He just, made it go at probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years that it wouldn't have gone. Anybody within the humanitarian space, go back and read the literature over the last 20, 30 years. We've been calling for reform. We've been calling for reset. We've been calling for localization. We've been calling for burden sharing. We've been calling for many things. All right. I am not saying that people dying, people protesting, United States gives 40% to the international humanitarian aid system. And that's not something that can be replaced by, like my brother Jamin said, by any other humanitarian actor or any other country. In fact, if you look at it, many countries have used the cover of the United States and Donald Trump and started, reducing their foreign aid, including the UK. And that money, where is it going? To arm so that they can deal with the Russian aggression. So I think, we have to be prepared that this is not a blip. This is the system now. The system is what we have now. So I think we have to be very brave. And I think a proper way of thinking around this should include, to a significant degree, the diasporan humanitarianism, or even the vernacular humanitarianism. Like all of us, we are paying school fees here and there. We are contributing towards public health emergencies within our communities. I think all these are humanitarianism. We just need to find ways of doing it on a cheap and effectively and efficiently. My sister asked about, the percentage of refugees African refugees that United States taking. It is still very high. To be honest with you, the numbers, I only pulled up the last year just as an illustration, but I think it is significant. If you look at the people from the DRC, people from Sudan, although it's becoming very difficult, people from Eritrea, what you see is a trend where countries that really have a lot of problems at home in terms of some of the key underlying structural root cause drivers that Jamin spoke about, that is the problem that we need to resolve. We cannot speak about refugee crisis without thinking about early intervention, early warning systems that regional agencies have, be it IGAD, ECOWAS, EAC, as well as SADC. Those needs to begin kicking in, including the AU process. It doesn't look very good if the DRC crisis in the eastern part of the country is being resolved in Qatar. EAC tried, SADC tried, and both summits went really badly. When the Rwandese president really did not react to the way it was treated. So we have to think as a package rather than thinking of this is the only way. No country can get out of its problem purely through external humanitarian support. We need to disabuse ourselves the notion that we can get out of this crisis purely through external benevolence. It cannot work. It has not worked. And I think we need to accept that. And the earlier we accept that, whether Big Aid comes back, whether United States comes back, that is immaterial if we really would want to have an African-led, an African financed. Others can help, but it has to be largely organic. It might take a longer time. It might be a little bit painful. And I'm not taking any solace in the fact that people with HIV/AIDS might not get their medicine. Women, people who have got GBV will not be able to get the support. But we have to get out of this humanitarian treadmill that is externally funded. Otherwise, ISS will organize a similar event 20 years down the road, and our sister Ottilia will be asking us, what is the future of humanitarian aid in Africa? There is no future of humanitarian aid in Africa. Humanitarian aid should be done as a temporary relief. We cannot make this a permanent reality. We cannot have our careers built on this. In 2025, Nobody should die because we cannot provide food. That is criminal. We cannot take pride in that. 30, 40 years after independence, we sit here and say, oh my goodness, USA cannot send food. Look around us. Look around all these countries. We can. Do you want to convince me that we cannot plant maize that takes 3 years to grow? Sorry, 3 months to grow. 3 months. Like we cannot grow. We cannot grow. We know very well that early response saves life. Early response is cheaper because it's by order around 30% cheaper. And you want to say that we cannot do that? I think it's about time we have some pride. It's about time we say, indeed, we've allowed this to go on for a very long time. It's about time people take agency to be able to potentially offer some solution. Over. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Abdullahi. In 20 years, I hope to be planning my retirement, but certainly not having the same conversation. I hope we would have gone further from that. Colleagues, on your screen now is already a poll just to assist us in improving on our events. Please do respond to the questions there. It is quite quick. And with your feedback, this will assist us in improving on our events. I do see Jameen and Paddy, I am coming to you, but I do see that Waldia now has been able to switch on their microphone. So before turning to you to respond to those issues that raised, both by Kirsty as well as Joseph, I invite Waldia to pose your question or make your comment. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I am from Ethiopia. The issue is so much interesting. It's a serious contemporary global issue. First, sorry being late, and I'm pleased to be here. And my idea is that about migration. As you know, it's one of the challenging issue right now at the international level. But International Organization for Migration, which is one of international institution, is not properly addressing the problem. That's my personal opinion. If you take, for instance, Africa, as an instance, Ethiopia, you may take Sudan, Somalia, wherever, you can get millions of migrants. Especially right now, there is a large number of people, especially IDP, internally displaced people. So my question is that what is the role of this international organizations like AU, or you may take IGAD and other international institutions? They are not discharging the responsibilities properly. So what is your comment regarding to this? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Waldia, for that. So in the basket of institutions that I'm asking Jameen and Paddy to speak to as well, Waldia has added international organizations like the International Organization for Migration. So would be interested to hear your perspectives. First to you, Jameen, then Paddy, and then after that, I have noted Iman Ahmed's hand. She will have the opportunity to make a comment or pose her question. Jameen, over to you.
Thank you. Picking from what Abdullahi is saying, I see the responsibility of dealing with displacement at this time being the role of every one of us, states and non-state actors. What do I see as the role of the non-state actors? I'm seeing the need for us, for those in displacement, us to focus on supporting them towards the path of self-reliance, skilling, so that they can be able to provide themselves. And we alleviate the demand for humanitarian support to support these particular populations. I see private sector, therefore, be a key enabler into this. I see bringing them into the discussion about forced displacement, the investment in those particular ecosystems as a critical aspect for the self-reliance aspect. Secondly, I see private sector as being critical in terms of trying to fundraise of how do we then deal with the situation of displaced community that we're having, including civil society organization participating in peace building, coming up with climate resilient aspects, and thirdly, working on advocacy with the various regional blocs and the continental blocs in terms of trying to untie some of the policy and legal reforms that are critical to enhance the free movement of people and support. I know both ECOWAS, SADC, the IGAD and the EAC, all of these particular bodies have various frameworks of the movement of people. There are frameworks on climate change. There are frameworks on dealing with the forced displacement question. I think what needs to be done is then for them to be able to activate principally about the prevention aspect of displacement in this particular region. Need for us to invest in early warning and early intervention for both crises and conflicts. I think we have waited for much too long for some of these particular atrocities to go on before we begin responding when we have displaced a big population of people. I think peace conversations in South Sudan have taken long before us seeing any particular results in Somalia, and there is a need for us to ask the question for how long we can then be able to do this. But then thirdly, it's about a coordinated response. I feel that we have these regional bodies, but then we do not then coordinate the level of response that is required for us to address the issues. Countries hosting refugees feel like this burden has then been left onto them. I dare say if this then continues, you then have the possibility of seeing hosting countries then refouling refugees from coming into their countries because they are seeing this then as being part of their burden. And therefore, there is a need to work on that, even as we work on the free movement of people and the mobility of population. Then we will then not speak about displaced population within our regional blocks as people go out to find various opportunities that they can then be able to build themselves. So those are the various inputs I see, the various actors, both state and non-state actors, needing to step up, especially at this particular time, because Abdullah is saying, we can be speaking about this particular issue over and over again. There is no help coming home, and therefore we need to have our own good solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paddy?
Jameen Abdullahi, it's like we were sitting in the same room in reflecting in these, and I was thinking about maybe is it a bit of a trick question for me, Ottilia, to be asked about the UN system? But listen, it's really complicated when we talk about international actors. And international actors, obviously, the diversity of them is plenty. But when we talk about the UN ecosystem, I think the words reform, review, reframe are really critical in this day and age, not just because we've understood, for instance, that there are a lot of issues, there are a lot of inefficiencies that have been seen out of the UN system, and it has been well funded to a larger extent, of course, depending on agencies and depending on different programs and so on and so forth. But the problem has been to see an impact and results. And then when we've seen kind of in a space where we are all, and I say all in terms of the development ecosystem actors, when we're all pushed against the wall by big donors, so the big boys in the room, if they cannot pull out their wallets, it's very easy to see where the UN system also goes. And sort of they go, okay, I'm sure there's a little bit of other kind of work that I could do for you, So instead of us seeing them as allies, sometimes they become gatekeepers. And they become gatekeepers not to the financing, which is a totally different topic, but where I see the gatekeeping, which is much more critical, is the collective advocacy that we want to see that moves towards adherence of human rights. So when, in the case of the Trump administration, I mean, we have seen that, they have gone full on, to sort of really say, we want to reframe how we do migration governance. And that's not really sitting very well with the majority of non-state actors and countries that have also called it out. But it's also within the UN system where we expect provisions and protections to happen that service provision begins to happen out of that and say, okay, but then, you know, US, I can help you to do repatriation. I can help you to do reintegration. I can help you to do returns in an effective way. When we know today that our core as non-state actors is not to look at alternatives for returns and really talk about regularization. This is what we would like the UN to really take for us to any avenue that they have and to the highest level. And so I think it's really, again, reform, review, reframe in every way and nature with every agency and every different program. And if we have to have an honest partnership, an equitable partnership, with the international ecosystem, we need to be candid about things. Another place where we need to be candid, and I think that brings me to the point on remittances that has been asked by Joseph, you know, how do we use the diaspora space for us to shift the funding strategy that we have? And you know, Abdullah, you hit the nail, you know, on the head. And, you know, diaspora responses and diaspora contributions are really organic. You know, this is my home. This is where I come from. You know, I know nothing else but to give to where I come from, you know, regardless of where the giving motivations are coming from, regardless whether, you know, some sentiments may say we are paying back or black tax or whatever we call it. This is home. This is what I know. And so it's organic in the way that, you know, sometimes there's no huge rationality, but there's a lot of emotion attached to it. And so what do we have to do? What do governments have to do with this very organic, very personal kind of contribution that migrants and diaspora want to make, particularly when we talk about diaspora, is that it's only sustainable when we really put them at the center of saying, you are part of those drivers of change. You are the real drivers of change. And I think that's when we begin to see that. And where does that come from? It comes from governments paying attention to detail and being proactive to engage, and not engaging in an extractive way. We want your remittances. It's engaging in, I also care about you kind of way. And so the African non-state actors, I think, did a paper which is quite interesting. And I can see my colleague, Dr. Iman Ahmed, is in the room as well. And we, you know, a couple of us co-authored this paper that we were really trying to look at what is the role that diaspora have and non-state actors in general have in terms of shaping narratives and culture. And, you know, the contributions are many, and I invite you to read that paper. Because it really tries to show that from presence in public policy spaces, and also within, you know, countries that have been much more creative in putting models and channels in which you don't just look at financial remittances, but we look at non-financial remittances. A favorite thing that a couple of us in the room here, and Ottilia will smile when I say this, when we go into any city in Europe, is to go and look for puff puff. We will go through the streets of Brussels. We will walk in Geneva. We will walk wherever we've been called, and when we've had the opportunity, I see Kirsty is also in the room, to hand for puff puff. This is a remittance. Today, Brussels is a multicultural city because you go to Matonge. Where do the people in Matonge come from? And so we begin to see just the agency that is not just about the money, but it's about the intel, the intellect, and the resilience that people have had when they've moved away from home. So that's a capital we need to package. And I think there are people who are very clever to do these different models that look beyond the diaspora engagement strategy and bring things into practicality. So that, you know, maybe when you go to, I don't know, Iceland, you're able to find the puff puff, and then maybe even have a conversation about how that diaspora member is contributing in their homeland through various channels. Thank you, Ottilia. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kadia. And that certainly did put a smile on my face, whether it's puff puff, beignet, fat cook, amagwinya. I think it's important that we recognize that the contribution of the diaspora globally is beyond just finances. It's culture, it's food, it's the way in which we connect. It's how we view a globalized world. So when there are policies that threaten the ability, one, for people that are seeking protection to get it, it will be the diaspora as well as those at home that are most likely the most vocal to be able to address these issues, because we see when migration is done in a way that protects fundamental human rights, we see how much we can actually get out of it, even if it does mean hunting for puff puff in the rain in Europe. I'm handing over now to Iman Ahmed, who's patiently been raising her hand. And thank you to Pitolindo Luvuno and Kirsty Kwacheng for sharing the information in the chat, including resources from other organizations such as Shabaka on some of the work that the diaspora are doing. Iman, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ottilia. Thanks to ISS for organizing, and thanks to the speakers for the very thought-provoking discussion. I really appreciate all your inputs. So my name is Iman Ahmed. I'm from the African Non-State Actors Platform as well. I happen to have worked in the field of humanitarian aid for the entire length of my career. Now we say this and we smile. I'm a strong advocate of tackling the root causes of migration. And 10 years of that was with UNHCR, and have just transitioned and transformed, witnessed many reforms of the UN system itself. I just have a few reflections to share, if I'm allowed. With regards to the US most recent actions and decisions, I agree with the speakers that this is not a surprise. It has been coming. We have seen it, partly closed an eye or partly just not taken it as seriously. That's why, in my opinion, it's coming as a slap on the face, but it has been happening. And it's not the US alone. It's a trend. It's a global trend from donor countries. It's happening in Europe, the closed borders, the reduced funding, and so on. And as of yesterday, as a Sudanese Canadian, yesterday, Canada issued new rules and regulations further restricting the asylum space and putting more restrictions in response to what's happening in the US, and Canada always being blamed of bringing us the refugees or under many pretexts. So it is a trend and it will only continue. Now, with regards to the issue of climate change contributing to migration, I think our people in the region have picked up on the conspiracy theories that are going around globally, and we need to find our simple, direct language to talk to our people about this, because it is happening in the region. We are seeing the droughts and floods and so on. I'm from East Africa, and we continue to witness this, further complicating the conflicts and other causes of displacement. With regards to the issue of some countries in Africa hosting refugees, and they have fantastic refugee policy like Uganda, and the burden, quote unquote, burden sharing or sharing of responsibility. I'm yet to see the African Union really incentivize, take stock of these moves and quantify that contribution in terms of money. If we try to compare it with what money we are getting from the US or from Europe against what a country like Uganda, for example, is investing in hosting refugees and providing them with opportunities, we might get surprised. So I put it back on the African Union to really take stock of that and to incentivize positive refugee policy. And I think that is our way of owning what we are doing towards our neighboring populations from within the continent. Now, Paddy, you have mentioned that the US is a center of excellence in education and research. I agree with that, but such excellence needs an environment of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and that is now shrinking. I want to bring it back home to Africa. There are examples such as the example of a program called Borderless Higher Education, held by York University in Canada, which has provided opportunities for refugees in Kenya to gain university level education. I think if we bring that back, such example, to our African universities to provide opportunities across the continent, it's gonna really elevate our refugees within the continent and provide hope. Finally, Mr. Abdullahi, thank you for speaking truth to my people in Sudan and the role of the emergency response rooms and the role of the Sudanese diaspora, and thanks as well, Paddy. And yes, we have been financing this. And the figure you have mentioned, Abdullahi, must have tripled at minimum during the last 2 years of the conflict, but it's not quantified. Nobody is taking stock of that. And we are just being ultra creative because of the collapse of the banking system. The remittances have never stopped. So it's time for our governments, as you mentioned, Paddy, to take stock of the remittances, to acknowledge, and to find a way that is transparent, dignified, and fair to the diaspora and to the recipients to incorporate this into the official narratives of the economy. Thank you so much, and sorry if I have gone long.
Thank you very much, Iman. When we started this discussion segment, it was recognizing who is in the room with us. It was also important that not everyone poses a question to the panel, but really what you've done is you've given us 5 key points that connect a lot of what the panelists have spoken about, the different levers that need to be manipulated, if you will, to be able to ensure that all of what we're talking about is actually achieved. I'm now going to give my panelists an opportunity in 1 bullet point, and not like a generous bullet point here, I'm talking a few words, each from you. You have spoken to a number of issues, but on your wish list, and I think what's important about this conversation is it was kicked off by us reflecting on the impact of the US's policy. But as the conversation evolved, we actually focused a lot on what needs to be done, recognizing that there is an impact, but that we can't just sit and say, well, there's an impact, so what next? So what I'm asking you panelists, and I'm going to go to you in alphabetical order, is I'm asking you 1 bullet point each of a key intervention that you think will be critical to addressing what could be the humanitarian fallout. So what can we do to limit the possible impact, so to speak? So if my alphabet is correct, Abdullahi first, Jamim second, then Paddy.
I think from my end, I think we have to admit that there are local, organic, proven solutions to displacement. I didn't want to get into it about the legal pathways, but even before reaching the legal pathways that the Tanzania has shown, there are other ways that can be done. Can we do a better socio-economic integration? Even with the legal path, I know you said 1 point, but if Kenya absorbs all the refugees that it has within its borders, that is less than 1 million people that will be added to the Kenyan census. That's 45 million. If Ethiopia does the same, if Uganda does the same, it doesn't change a great deal. I think we need to have a moral courage that nobody wants to leave their home if their home is not a shark-infested ocean. People don't seek refuge because it's beautiful. Nobody wants to beg. Nobody wants to be given handouts. Please, the refugee solution, we can resolve the refugee crisis. And I'll stop at that because I need to give us a chance to. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Abdullahi. Jamin and Paddy, please do not follow Abdullahi's lead and stick to 1 bullet point. Jamin.
Thank you very much. I'm a favorite of speaking about the need for prevention, and I think 2 things. 1, we need to shift about our displacement governance that focuses only on providing humanitarian support, ignoring the very foundation root causes that lead to displacement, but also the need to invest in more development approaches to the displaced communities so that they can be able to build and support their own communities. For me, I think that is critical and calls for the change in the general architecture of how we do things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paddy.
Thank you, Ottilia. It's really hard to come after those 2, but I was just thinking that, okay, there goes my half a minute. I think for me, what still remains critical is how we look at African agency in its diversity and how we use that to leverage our negotiation and migration diplomacy. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Paddy. You see, I thought there was going to be a comma but I appreciate this. Thank you, colleagues, all of you, those of you that have connected online and listened in, those of you that have provided critical inputs to this conversation. The question we were attempting to answer today was, one, a reflection on what Trump's refugee suspension means for Africa, what we got out of it, inputs from Africans, whether you are from Zambia, Zikomo, Paddy, Abdullahi, Jamin, Asanteni Sana, Shukran for your inputs, or those of you that have shared in the comments, Kirsty in the UK of Ghanaian origin, or Iman in Canada of Sudanese origin, or Woldia from Ethiopia. You have all provided really critical inputs into this conversation. So the 4 takeaways that have been shared by our panelists are perhaps what I leave you with. Local and organic solutions matter. It'll be African approaches that seek to address African issues. Have the moral courage to be able to do that. And moral courage requires good governance, true leadership, and an investment back home. And then prevention is always better than cure, whether in the space of refugee issues or in medicine. Let's shift the discourse from only looking at how do you heal the problem, and also invest in the mechanisms that are needed for development, for prosperity, for Africa and her people. And then finally, African agency is key. Right now, before we get to the moral courage, we also need Africans. And when I say African leaders, colleagues, hear me correctly. I am not meaning African political leaders alone. I mean those of you that are with us in this seminar as well. African leaders ensuring that African voices are heard in rooms where before we may not have been invited, but we are present. So with that, great appreciation to the team that put this event together, our senior researcher, Margaret Wanyani, in the background, making sure that the speakers are here with us, and our IT team as well. And of course, to the African Non-State Actors Platform for partnering with the ISS on this event. We look forward to your insights beyond this conversation, taking it forward, ensuring that when I say African leadership lies within you, that we actually see it happening in the different rooms in which we are occupying. So again, Paddy Sianga-Knudsen from the African Non-State Actors Platform, Jamwin Kuswania from the International Rescue Committee, and Abdullahi Halafe from Refugees International. We appreciate you preparing for this event, sharing your insights, and enriching our discussion in a way that we could never have imagined. Have a lovely day further.